Welcome to this shared learning session on building community online, about learning from online LGBTQ peer support. My name is Rory and I use they and he pronouns. So, this session we're going to look at forms of peer support in the LGBTQ community, what that looks like, whether it's different, how it's different, the positive and negative impacts of shifting to online support for LGBTQ people, but also I think there are some elements of that are more widely applicable. We're going to be thinking about managing those impacts and creating positive online peer support spaces for LGBTQ people, and we're going to be thinking about building communities in online peer support. So this session is partially being recorded, so this feels weird to say, but if you're watching this a few weeks' time on YouTube or something else, you're seeing what's said in the main room of the training. At times we'll go to breakout rooms and those won't be recorded. People will be able to feed back in from them in various different ways. This is to ensure anonymity. A bit about me. Well, this is technically a bit about Switchboard, but I realized I need to explain some stuff about me before I start talking about that. I work at NSUN and I also work at Switchboard in Brighton and Hove. There I am the trans non-binary survivors project lead, which means that I run the peer group for trans non-binary and intersex people who've experienced sexual violence. And that's been running for a couple of years, but the most recent round of it, I guess, has all been online because of the pandemic. So Switchboard has been running since 1975. It was originally a helpline. The helpline is still active today. In addition to stuff like the helpline, community navigation, there's a bit of like health research that we do. Our main thing is peer support and community building, and this idea of like, what does community-led support for LGBTQ people look like? So we run peer support groups for LGBTQ disabled and neurodiverse people, for LGBTQ people who are over 50, LGBTQ people with dementia, and also trans, non-binary and intersex people who experience sexual violence. That latter one is the one that I run. It's worth saying that all of these groups look incredibly different. And there's something really lovely about that. We've kind of learned all of the stuff that relates to how those communities want to access peer support. And so the models of how we do it across those different projects really vary. So thinking about peer support in LGBTQ communities, there are kind of a lot of different elements, and I really want to take, at this point, a really broad sense of peer support. Later, when we're talking about like specific ways to make peer support more accessible, I've kind of been thinking more about like the classic peer support group. But I also think providing a little bit of context in terms of like what peer support actually is in LGBTQ communities and how it exists is quite an interesting background, and it's quite an important thing to keep in mind. So in terms of the support that exists in LGBTQ communities, we can think about three sort of broad areas. There's information sharing, there's resource sharing, and there's emotional support or emotional sharing. I was really going back and forwards on like whether we call it emotional support, because that sounds a little bit one-sided in some ways, and maybe that's opposite to the peer support ethos that we're talking about, but anyway. So information sharing. If you think about the context in the UK, say Section 28, say current efforts to try and make like sex education in schools more LGBTQ inclusive, or current efforts to try and stop that, for instance. We know that LGBTQ communities in the UK, kind of worldwide, but UK especially, I guess I'm talking about it now, there's a lot of stuff people don't tell you about being LGBTQ or about being queer or about being trans, and information sharing where people within that community get together and say, this is what it's like for me, or this is what it's like for my friend, or this is how you access sexual health services. This is how you access trans healthcare. These sorts of information links are really, really common, and they're a really, really important part of how people learn about themselves and learn about their community. Some examples are, especially on social media, things like trans Reddit, Facebook groups, spaces where people share information. We can also think about resource sharing. There's a real history of giving and sharing amongst people in the LGBTQ community. So that's money, time, space, housing. I mention this because obviously thinking about peer support, there is a sense sometimes that when we do peer support in a very organized way, we think about it as exclusively being emotional support, and sometimes it is. Especially if it's, say, part of a kind of under the banner of a charity, or we're having to put very firm boundaries in place. We're kind of saying, you know, I'm not, we're going to be peers in this context, but we are trying not to be like friends in another context or something like that. Sometimes that works, and sometimes it's really, really important. Sometimes it's also not the way that peer support ends up working in LGBTQ communities, because we're extraordinarily small communities. People usually have multiple relationships inside and outside of those different spaces, and some of those relationships might be might involve sharing money, time, space, all of that stuff. An example of a kind of organized attempt to share resources is 5 for 5, which is a like big mass crowdfunding effort for trans feminine causes in the UK. So it's basically a donations pooling resource that pools donations and then gives it out to causes and individuals. And finally, emotional support. This is the thing that we're really going to be talking about, but I think it's important to think of it in the context of these other kinds of information and resource sharing. So emotional support is extraordinarily big, and I've really tried to think about it in terms of like being with, celebrating, mourning, listening. There's a real massive variety of what emotional support might look like. And again, when we talk more specifically about like ways to make peer support groups accessible for LGBTQ people, I'm going to be focusing on just that sort of classic group setting and thinking about how that works online for LGBTQ people. But I think it's really important to think about these other aspects of queer or LGBTQ community building that involve a kind of emotional being with and a kind of like sharing. So some examples I've mentioned are Queer Black Christmas, which was set up by Tanya Compass, who also set up Exist Loudly, which is a crowdfunding effort to get money to bring a lot of queer Black young people together for Christmas who might not otherwise have spaces to go to celebrate. Misery is a QTPOC, that's queer, trans, intersex people of colour, dance party, sober space. They do a lot of online events at the minute, obviously, and there's something really interesting about how they are taking this idea of like joy and celebration and making that a really important space in which to talk about mental health. And I've also included Switchboard as emotional support, obviously. One example from the helpline is that sometimes people will call up just to be silent, or they will do multiple hang-up calls. At Switchboard, while that can be frustrating, we take that as an indication that people are calling up and want to hear somebody else answer the phone and don't quite have the resources or the capacity to, you know, maybe say what they're there for or what they need, but are getting something nonetheless from calling up and knowing that in theory, if they want to share something, there is a space for them. Obviously, there are some limitations to support in LGBTQ communities. So there's blocked information about LGBTQ people, systemic lack of resources. If within the LGBTQ community, we are supporting each other by sharing our money, our time, our space, our emotional energy. Um, we have to acknowledge that all of that stuff is already limited by sort of systemic oppression and various different intersecting sorts of like um, uh, disadvantage, I guess. There's this question about how to access support if you're in the closet. What are ways that there are some places where, say, Pride, for instance. Maybe this isn't a good example. I guess I'm thinking about like part of the point of Pride is that you are there to like celebrate, be super out, and all of that stuff. And so, is it more or less accessible for people who are in the closet? Or is there the argument that, you know, if you're in the closet, you can kind of go to Pride and say, oh, well, I'm just there for the party, something like that. Um, there's prejudice and violence within LGBTQ communities as well as without. So racism, ableism, internalized homophobia and transphobia don't go away. And there are, those very much still exist. I don't think, while I'm talking about the importance of LGBTQ peer support, I don't want to create a sense that like the LGBTQ community is like this like perfect like radical utopia, and we kind of have everything that we need and never do anything wrong within that. And finally, there's this question about like what's the balance between being community led while not putting a huge amount of pressure on community members who, by the nature of what they're doing, are also dealing with systemic oppression and their own mental health, their own physical health. It's that classic thing about peer support where it's being carried by the people who are the most affected. And that's really important. It's also potentially really, really difficult and really heavy. So that's something very important to think about. So since about a year ago, we've been doing emotional support at a distance. Switchboard has, we kind of felt like we had a bit of a head start with some of this because obviously we'd been doing like support from a distance over the phone for quite a while. It's not the same, but there are some useful takeaways about like the fact that it's possible, the fact that people will want to access it if it's there and it's good, that were quite helpful for us setting up these kind of alternate structures. What I really wanted to do is to go through like the super basic, obvious differences between coming into a peer support group in a physical space and coming into a peer support group in an online space, and thinking about how those super obvious basic differences impact everybody, but especially looking at it through an LGBTQ lens. And I came up with these 4 very basic changes. You're visible on a camera, maybe. You're in your home, usually. You're not physically around others, and you can communicate via text or voice. I'm just taking this phone. Okay, great. What I'm going to do, I'm going to go through what I came up with, and then I'm going to stop the recording, and in breakout groups, we're going to have a chance to talk about if I've left anything out, and also what we think some of the ways of mitigating these impacts are. I should also say that some of these impacts are positive, some of them are negative, some of them are just different. I guess my watchword, my thing that I really try and think about whenever I'm thinking about online peer support is you can't assume that it's always going to be better or that it's always going to be worse, but you can assume that it's going to be different, and you can kind of prepare for that. So you're visible on camera. What impacts might that have for LGBTQ people particularly? So cameras and that kind of like very mediated like visual experience is a super common trigger for gender dysphoria. People are read differently on screen. I can tell you that I can be in a Zoom work meeting and then go to the corner shop and then pick up a delivery, and I can be read, like my gender can be assumed in 3 different ways over the course of those 3 different interactions. Being on screen, alternatively, could be a chance to control how you're seen. You can adjust your lighting, I've got a little lamp here that I play with before I come onto a Zoom meeting. You can adjust what's behind you, maybe. You maybe feel like you actually have more control over how you're seen than you do in a face-to-face interaction. Which kind of comes to the next thing, which is that online meetings often mean staring at your own face. I should say something I didn't say today. Zoom has a hide self view function, which is really, really helpful. So if you click on your image, go to the three dots, you should find that option. Staring intently at other people's faces can feel uncomfortable. This isn't like an LGBTQ thing. This is a everybody thing. We are not hardwired to be like staring directly down the barrel of other people's attention all the time. And finally, turning a camera off for any of the above reasons or anything else can be read as not participating, as being not present or not interested. And I think that's really difficult, because we've kind of created this this social like agreement that if you're on Zoom, you have to have your camera on, and that's the whole point of it. And I think that can be really difficult and kind of doesn't really use the format to its whole advantage. So you're in your own personal space, you're in your home usually. This has massive ramifications for LGBTQ people. I think this is one of the biggest things for me, is, do you have a home? Like, do you have a permanent space? A lot of like homelessness within the LGBTQ community is obviously really high, and I think like, I can't remember the word for it. I want to say invisible homelessness. I'm not sure that's what I mean, but like homelessness that people often don't recognize as being homelessness, so couch surfing or staying, like, yeah, that kind of like staying with friends, being on the move sort of experience is very common, especially. Is that home safe? So are you in a space where if you say I'm gay, you won't be overheard through the walls? Or if you say, oh, I think I might be trans, you won't be like listened to, or someone who is in the room can hear you? And, you know, if you're overheard saying that, are you putting yourself in danger? People might see a private side of you, so you might feel pressured to move like a pride flag behind you if you are having a work meeting. That might feel inappropriate. You might feel pressured to like wear different clothing, move the stuff that's in your room. Also, it can just feel really vulnerable. People seeing where you live. That's and again, this kind of goes through everybody, but there are kind of dynamics to it that especially impact LGBTQ people. A good thing is that it's accessible. No public transport costs. You don't have to travel. There's no risk of street harassment on your way to the group. When I was running trans survivors groups in person, this was a really key thing that we realized was really difficult, because we were trying to find an accessible space, so somewhere that could be easily accessed by people using wheelchairs, or and somewhere that felt like the right kind of environment. But that was already difficult. And then we also realized that the perfect space, unfortunately, was somewhere that was quite dark. Like the street lamps weren't great, and the public transport links weren't great. And we got there in the evening, a winter evening, 5 or 6. It's completely dark, and we realized, God, I wouldn't feel safe walking it. Like, especially not if I'm like I'm kind of fine, but like if I were like visibly gender non-conforming trans woman, for instance, I wouldn't feel comfortable walking into that space or getting to that space. If you're in your own home after a peer support group, you're kind of there with your thoughts afterwards. There's no walk home to decompress. There's no saying goodbye to everybody at the door. There's no change in setting. This is a really key thing for anybody who's doing any kind of, I guess, emotional work or support work over the internet or online, is that when you hang up, when you stop the call, you're just kind of there. It's a very abrupt ending. And so that can be really difficult to deal with. You're not physically around people. This can feel really safe. You can hit a button and leave, no consequences. It's maybe easier than standing up and walking out of a physical room if you don't feel comfortable. It can be awkward. It's really hard to know when to speak. You can't read body language. You can't do the thing of like preparing to talk by sort of, or it's harder to do the thing of like preparing to talk and signaling your intention to talk by looking at people and kind of gearing up for that. It's lonely. You might wish that you could get or give a hug, smile at people, share eye contact. Zoom eye contact is really weird in some way. I mean, it's not possible. I'll talk a bit about that later, but there's no way to like have a sidebar with one person or share a look with one person. Alternatively, that might be a relief. You don't have to worry about eye contact or hugs. That could be really, really comfortable for you. Sometimes I definitely feel that way. And communicating using voice or text. You can mute yourself and just listen. That can be really, really pleasant for a lot of people, really helpful. Using text can mean not dealing with voice dysphoria. So if you have gender dysphoria triggered by the way that your voice sounds, using text can be an alternative for that. Your name shows up next to your face and you can add your pronouns. That can make things easier, or it can feel really exposing. You can't crosstalk or have spontaneous sidebars. Well, not really. They definitely feel different and they're a little bit harder to access. You can maybe use breakout rooms, but that's decided by the host if you're using Zoom. And you can maybe use a chat function if that's available to you. And text might be more or less accessible. Sometimes we think of text as being more accessible because it doesn't require speaking up. But there's also a question of like, what are people's English levels, literacy levels? How comfortable do people feel reading quickly? Are you excluding people who cannot follow a quick succession of like things in the chat box, basically? Okay, so it seemed like we were really interested in the discussion break in especially talking about like community building and empowering group participants and changing from a like almost like a passive to an active role within the group. So luckily we've got some content and some opportunities to talk about that later. First, I'm just going to go through this table of, I was going to say solutions. They're not really solutions, they're more just like responses. So this idea of like you're visible on camera, so what? So consider inviting people to turn cameras on or off as they remind people that they can hide self-view on Zoom if that's the platform that you're using. Encourage people to take breaks from the screen. I think it's really important to say, look, just because we are sitting and looking at a computer doesn't mean that you have to stare right into the camera for the whole hour or hour and a half. You can get up, you can lie down, you can like, I don't know, roll out a yoga mat and lie on the floor if that's comfortable. I think we might as well take advantage of the fact that we are at home and hopefully are in a relatively comfortable environment. In group agreements, I think specifying that the group commits to not making assumptions on gender based on visual appearance, and it can actually be really useful in a group agreement to have some kind of clause on how you deal with people slipping up on pronouns. So what we say is that we agree to validate whoever was misgendered and correct the person who did it, because we know that it can just be a mistake, and but it's really important to notice that mistake and to appreciate kind of as a group and figure out how we like minimize that and respond to it. People might want to sit slightly off camera. This is a thing that happens in some of our groups. It doesn't tend to happen in the group that I run because that tends to be very discussion focused. So it's a short like discussion session. In other groups where they're slightly longer and they're more like social hangouts, sometimes people will not turn their camera off, but like just move a little bit so that like their leg or a bit of their arm is visible, like their cat is visible, but they're not. And it's a nice way of like indicating I'm here, I'm present, I'm listening. I don't want to be perceived currently. Like I don't. It's a really nice way of like being with while not having to be super like turned on or like on like yeah in the moment. So you are in your home usually. Some ways to respond to this: modeling privacy. So as a facilitator, it's really useful to, I did do this earlier, wear headphones or explain that you're alone. Mea culpa, I'm alone apart from my cat, and I promise she's not going to tell anybody anything. Acknowledging that we're tuning in from different places. I think I mentioned this earlier, but just encouraging people to yeah, take advantage of the space around them, and enjoy the fact that we're not sitting in a circle in a community centre. Even while we might miss that, there are still some benefits to be gained from not being there. Sending follow-up emails, that can be really helpful for that like sudden drop afterwards. So sending just something that I recommend pre-writing it so that you're not exhausted after a group and trying to figure out what you need to tell people. But just a quick check-in to say thank you. It was really great to see you tonight or this evening. And suggesting there's an aftercare menu, which is something that I heard of from Healing Justice London. They basically, after their events, send round a suggestion of like, these are some things that you might want to do to unwind or decompress. I usually send out things with signposts for helplines and things that are currently open. So if people feel like they need a bit of extra support, they've got a place to turn to. And finally, I'd always recommend finishing a group with a check-in or a grounding or decompression exercise, and also recognizing that a lot of different grounding exercises are one, sometimes extremely frustrating, and I'm sure we can all relate to someone telling us to breathe better and finding that like just quite annoying. But also there are some grounding exercises that can be quite triggering depending on people's experience of like gender dysphoria, trauma, stuff like that. I know, for instance, like body scans are really difficult sometimes, or anything that involves like focusing on the body or that kind of embodied self stuff can be really difficult for some people. Something that we've found is a really nice check-in is just changing the subject and switching to like, okay, for the last 5 seconds, last 5 minutes, we are just going to talk about like something nice that happened recently, or tell me like something really beautiful that you've seen, or something like that. And that lets people, what's nice about that is it means that people, it's not too obvious if people decide they don't want to involve themselves in it. But people can also participate just by listening rather than speaking up. So this gap about not being physically around people, it sort of seemed like in the discussion group that was something that was really coming up, like this sense of you can't give someone that much individualized attention. You can't make eye contact with someone. You can't. There are real barriers to just being with, like online communication demands that it makes us it forces us to be very forthright in some ways. You know, if we want to indicate I understand and relate to that, then we're kind of forced to say out loud, I understand and relate to that. And that can be quite clunky and difficult and complicated. There are some hand gestures which you can use to fill in for body language, which might work if you have people on screens. We use BSL applause, which is like this, which is for like congratulations, excitement, like fervent agreement. And we also use like this for I feel you, which is really helpful if you don't want to bother unmuting or you feel too vulnerable to unmute and say, I really relate to that. You can kind of just like put your hand at your collarbone. As a facilitator, it's really important that we remember that not depending on what device people are using, people might not be able to see those reactions. So we try to name them, and we also try to model them, because people don't use them unless you prove that it's an okay thing to do. It's also, if people aren't on camera, there's obviously that isn't going to work. But there are also like Zoom reactions. So depending on the platform that you're using, that can be helpful. Encouraging crosstalk amongst participants. The mute button is your friend, because when you're muted, people understand that you're not going to jump in, and it's a really I find myself like inching towards the unmute button, but talking myself out of it, because I know that if I stay quiet for just long enough, someone will jump in, and it will become a crosstalk rather than people asking me as a facilitator questions, or giving me as a facilitator like a statement that they want me to respond to, which would set up more of almost like a counselor advisory vibe than a group of people coming together to offer each other support. Setting up ways for people to indicate that they'd like to be called upon is really important, and asking people to invite each other to speak. So if you have a hand gesture that indicates a hand gesture, or like the raise hand button on Zoom, pointing out that yes, the facilitators will keep an eye out for that, but if someone else notices that a hand is up, it's absolutely great for them to like invite them to speak, or mention that, or bring that up. That creates, again, much less of that sense that like the facilitator is sitting at the center of all of this stuff and is deciding when everybody speaks, rather than being another part of the conversation. And finally, looking at the camera, not at faces. This is something for you and for everybody. Eye contact is really weird over Zoom. But if you look at the camera, it feels to other people like you are making eye contact with them. If you look at people's faces, it looks like you are staring at a random different bit of the screen. This is not to say that it's better or worse, just something to be aware of. I think some people find it really uncomfortable to see someone apparently making eye contact with them constantly, and some people find it more reassuring. I don't know why I mentioned this. I guess it's a thing to like take into account. And finally, thinking about like communicating using text and voice. Encouraging people to use the text box if preferred, and modeling this. So using it in group agreements and having simple shorthand for text boxes. So for instance, you could say, if you want to indicate in the text box that you really agree with something, you can put a plus sign, and you can kind of do those things where people can almost communicate non-verbally using text. And the only thing with this is that trying to facilitate both like visual, verbal, text, and if you're like getting private messages, or maybe you're WhatsApping with a co-facilitator about someone else who has emailed and is trying to get in and all of that, that's a lot of information for you to be taking on board. So I think it's a really good practice to have agreed with your co-facilitators who is looking at the chat, who is focusing on the group in general, and also to be open with the people in the group about that, so that if you, as like the person who's facilitating the room, the like visual and verbal components, miss something in the chat, you can just be honest and say, yeah, that's not my job. I don't have the attention span in order to facilitate all of that together. Considering literacy and comfort with written text communications in the group, bear in mind, things like if people are if people are struggling with literacy or struggling with written text, it might be harder for them to figure out what people's names are or what people's pronouns are. It might be harder to use the chat box. Just making sure that doing those things isn't a condition of being able to access the space, basically. I think it's fine to have a variety of different forms of communication in one space, some of which will be more accessible for some people and some of which will be more accessible for others, but just making sure that that doesn't mean that people can't access the space as a whole, or like not everything is happening in the chat box, if that makes sense. Finally, inviting people to share and add pronouns, but not making it mandatory. This is a really hard line to walk, especially in spaces where, yeah, I mean, especially in like trans positive spaces where we want to be, um, we want to be able to. I certainly want to be able to model like um, introducing and using my pronouns, and it's very important for me that people know what my pronouns are and that they use them. At the same time, in uh, especially LGBTQ support groups, it's not uncommon at all for people to not know what their pronouns are, to change what they want people to use, to change names. A really nice thing, if this is something that is coming up, might be to include in your group agreement that just because someone says what their pronouns are one time doesn't mean that that won't be different the next week, or and that this is a space where people are encouraged to try stuff out and figure stuff out. Um, yeah. Um, let me see what time it is so I can figure out what we're going to do next. Okay, cool. We can come back to this later. There's going to be another discussion opportunity, but given the interest in thinking about shifting power from facilitation to group participants, I'm going to go on to the next slide, which is about barriers to building community through online peer support. So there's this this thing that came up when we were talking about needing to make sure that community-led doesn't equal all of the pressure on vulnerable community members all the time, and also making sure that a peer support group is kind of owned and directed and led and moved by the people who benefit from it most. Some extra barriers or complications with online stuff include digital exclusion, which can take kind of different forms, whether that's access to internet, technology, or knowledge. There's this element of like spontaneity, which isn't impossible online, but it's more rare. The spaces tend to be less fluid and more organized. What that means is that unlike if, say, you were a support group in some like back room of a community center or something like that. You finish the support group, and then three people who were kind of having a sidebar meet up afterwards and say, "Hey, that was really interesting what you said. Why don't we like talk about it more, or why don't we like try and I don't know, set up our own group for this very specific thing that we've discovered that we have in common?" That's a lot harder when all of the terrain in which we're having these conversations is totally controlled by the facilitators. We can hit a button and suddenly everyone is back home alone in their own rooms again. Which relates to this next point. So power concentrates in the hands of a smaller number of people, and it's harder to organize around the edges, which is where a lot of LGBTQ people often feel comfortable and find support. And finally, there's like privacy and safety concerns. So I've I spent most of this sort of training session talking about Zoom, and there are a lot of people who do not want to use Zoom because of concerns around privacy, concerns around safety. This can also like there's an intersection there with like if we're thinking about mental health issues and what's comfortable for people who deal with anxiety and paranoia. Like there's a huge barrier to accessing online support services and online communication technologies. So there are ways to think about building community in the sense of empowering group members and making peer groups, peer support groups, not just places where people are kind of passive recipients of support, but people who are, yes, able to receive support and also able to give it and have a voice in how that support looks and how it works. I think there's this question about like, how much power do participants actually have to change what happens in the group? If a majority of participants turned around and said, you know what, we've decided that this group should be called X and it should focus on Y. What are the mechanisms that they would have to change that? That's going to be impacted by things like funding. It's going to be impacted by things like organizational structure. I think we need to really think about these things when we're talking about how we encourage group participants to become to be active, basically, because there is sometimes a sense in some mental health spaces, especially with like kind of lived experience, expertise, and stuff like that, that we are invited to have input on the way that things work, but ultimately no decision-making power. And so there's a lot of, say, advisory work for people with lived experience of either mental ill health or distress or trauma, but also people with lived experience of, say, being part of the LGBTQ community or experiencing other kinds of societal oppressions. It's very common that there's a sense of, well, we would like your opinion, we would like your feedback, but we are ultimately people who are not involved in that community, or people who are involved in that community, but are paid to be facilitators or are have another level of like power and control. We are going to be the people who make the decisions. I don't think that necessarily. Do I think that? I was going to say I don't know that necessarily rules out people like having active say in a group that is structured that way, but I think it's important to be transparent about like what are the actual parameters in which we are working. So some ideas about like concrete mechanisms to give people ownership over the space. These are not things that you always absolutely have to do. They are suggestions for like what would happen if you did this. So giving people the option to exchange contact details away from you if you're a facilitator. This is like, again, this is something that would probably happen if you were meeting in a face-to-face environment. And also, I think I mentioned this earlier, the LGBTQ community, especially if you're organizing on like a regional basis. So for the group that I run is Sussex-based people. And so there's a lot of overlap in terms of like people know this person from like, I was going to say the pub, from the before times when the pub was allowed. People know this person from this other group that they're in, etc., etc. So acknowledging that there are going to be those dual relationships, and that as much as sometimes we think about like peer support spaces or group spaces as like this space almost outside of the world where we can talk about stuff in a very different context, those relationships still do exist. Building in reflection on how the group is going, and not just at the end when everyone is tired, and also not just through feedback forms. I think it's really important that the group gets to talk about the group as a group. I really hope that made sense. I just heard myself saying group so many times. The idea, so something that we've tried is steering groups and sort of saying, we're going to have a meeting. This is not another group session. It's a chance to talk about like how we found so far, what you want to change about stuff, how you would like this to run, basically. And that's been really beneficial, actually. And it's been really helpful. It's really helpful to not have those conversations with the kind of makeup of the group, but not have it within a group space, within the space that we'd usually be like talking about, like emotional stuff and experiences and stuff like that. Sharing your facilitation skills, viewing peer support as a process of upskilling, really. It sounds a little tawdry, but you know what I mean. I think it is true that the peer support groups are a space where we learn stuff, right? Like we learn how to talk about our experiences. We learn how to listen to other people's. Ultimately, sharing our facilitation skills is part of that. People learn how these spaces get facilitated, how they develop. I think it's really useful to, especially to talk about content versus process. So when we're talking about, like, as facilitators, we might often or occasionally do a content process shift where, say, two people are talking about an experience and they have in common, but they disagree about how it made them felt. And things are getting a little heated and complex and difficult, and it feels uncomfortable. We move away from talking about the content. We move away from talking about, oh, this experience sounds like this and this experience sounds like that, and move into, it seems like we've moved into a space where, like, there's some kind of like opposition going on. I just want to make sure that, like, there's that everybody else in the room is sort of like feeling what I'm feeling. Are you feeling like, yeah, talking about what is happening rather than the content of what's being discussed. I think we can flag that up, and I think it gives people like a bit of a toolkit to think about the group as more than just a kind of receptacle for, like, all of their thoughts and feelings, but also like a space that they are involved in making. It gives people more of an ability to have a say, I guess, on almost what the atmosphere of the group is. So building collaborative group agreements is also really important. I have to say, this is quite, I think this is tricky in some ways, because there's almost like the group agreement happens and then maybe sometimes it just doesn't get updated, or you can try and update it every single group meeting, but then that takes away time from the group itself. There is a balance here. I have no idea how to strike it. I think it's a matter of kind of being transparent and open and asking group participants, like, what they want to see in it. Is there stuff that's come up that's not been mentioned? Is there stuff that's in there that seems kind of irrelevant now that we've been part of this group for a couple of months, etc. And finally, being proactive about access. This is a huge thing. Like, rates of disability and mental health and mental illness within the LGBTQ community are huge. I should say, like, all of this stuff is relevant pretty much for any community, any like peer support group. I'm just building, I guess, from my own experience within LGBTQ organizations. But being proactive about access is the number one way to actually make people, one, come to the group, two, feel like they are able to contribute to the group, three, feel like the group is theirs rather than just a space that they come to. I think it's something about people not having to always do the work of reaching out and making sure that the group is suitable for them. If you can say, we've taken these steps to make it accessible, that immediately sort of creates a kind of like good faith and a sense that you are really interested and invested in the group as a whole. Sorry, my cat is like yelling for my attention. I also wanted to talk about, we mentioned we mentioned safe spaces. I also wanted to add this idea of brave spaces. I don't believe that brave and safe spaces are mutually exclusive, in the sense of, I don't really think they're different things, but they might be, it's useful to think about both of them, I guess. It's a bit of a like nudge in certain different directions. So if we're thinking about these sorts of safe spaces, then they need to include like a baseline belief that you'll not come under threat for who you are. And that might be a very different experience to being outside in the general world, especially if you're an LGBTQ person, if you're a Black person or a person of color, if you're a person with a disability, disabled person, all of those things might not be that belief that you won't come under threat for who you are, or that you're not in danger, or that you're not like in a situation which is hostile to you might be unusual. Same maybe with a trust in others to voice their needs and respect yours. That kind of like two-way thing, I think is really important in these spaces. It's interesting in a lot of peer support spaces, certainly that I've been in, a lot of people spend a lot of time thinking about how much or how little they talk. There are often kind of conversations like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm saying too much," or someone might jump in and like, if you've invited someone to speak, they might say, "Sorry that I've been so quiet." I think it's really healthy to sort of say, well, you can decide exactly how much or how little you want to contribute to this space. And also trusting that they are making the right decision for themselves, like they have decided to speak or not to speak exactly as much as is right for them in the moment. These kinds of spaces often feel uncomfortable. They are not spaces in which we are always happy or comfortable, or even where we necessarily know what's going on. So a willingness to be wrong, uncomfortable, confused, sad, within your tolerance, and knowing what that tolerance is a really key part of this. Being able to step in and out of that space at will, and not being unable to enter and not being compelled to stay. And finally, trust that if the space isn't working, you can play a part in changing it. I think that feels like a really key element, especially when thinking about kind of community-led spaces and how to shift that power from and shift that role that people are playing within spaces like these. I have permission to share some of the discussion that we had following that conversation about moving power amongst like community peer support groups, and including people in discussions and in the direction of how groups work. So some really interesting insights, especially about safeguarding, about like how we as facilitators either notice in ourselves a tendency to move away from that option to give people more control and more maybe space, I guess, or how we find an urge to kind of just go towards it and then figure out later and keep a kind of like active safeguarding process that looks at what comes up, tries to imagine and tries to pan out all the possible scenarios, and while accepting that also sometimes unexpected things will inevitably happen, and that there is no way to be so prepared that you will never be wrong-footed or you will never be surprised. Accepting that and also having a structure that can be reactive, I think is really, really important and came out in our discussion as a really key element. We also had discussions about how safeguarding it can be really tricky when you don't necessarily know that much information about a person. So especially on an online group, it's possible to bring people into a room while knowing almost nothing about them, maybe an email address. And there are questions about, one, like whether that's useful in particular groups, whether it allows for anonymity, or whether it maybe feels less secure for potential group participants. It also raises questions about what are the responsibilities that you have when you don't actually know that much information about a person who may be in distress or may need some extra support. And I think that kind of reflected on our discussions about organizational structure and whether, if people are part of an unconstituted group or a voluntary group, whether that's what that means for decisions about safeguarding, decisions about structure, decisions about collecting information. And one really helpful like thought experiment might be to run through, okay, these are like the organizational structures I'm working within. What would be the way that I would do it if I were working under different structures? What would that produce? And what would that mean? And kind of letting that inform or yeah, bring context to some of our choices and some of our ways of working within online peer support groups. I think that was most of it. I'm really sorry if I haven't captured that well. I really hope I have. I found the discussion really, really helpful and this whole session fantastic. So yeah, thank you very much to everyone who's here with me and to anyone who's watching this. It still feels really strange to say that. Some further materials. So the logbooks is, it's not by my switchboard, it's by London and National Switchboard. Because these were all set up in like the 70s and 80s as voluntary organisations, everyone called it the same thing or ended up with the same name, but we're not actually affiliated. The logbooks is a podcast from London National Switchboard, which looks at their like their call records basically from however many years, like since 1974, I think. And it's really just like an insight into the stuff that yeah, they work with and how it relates to LGBTQ identities and communities today. Strongly recommend. I'm also going to plug NSUN's LGBTQ and survivor activism panel, which was from our annual general meeting was it last year? Was it this year? Yes, last year. Oh God, I have no concept of time anymore. It was really great, and I strongly recommend having a look at it because it's a really interesting insight into that intersection of LGBTQ and mental health survivors, service users. So we've got Feeling Queer, who NSUN is currently in the process of creating a zine with, which I'm really excited to produce. Feeling Queer work with LGBTQ people who have diagnoses of what are called personality disorders or who have experiences of trauma. Not Your Fault run online like text-based support groups for men and non-binary people, whether cis or trans men who have experience of sexual violence. Proud Trust is like an umbrella organisation for LGBTQ young people, and they have a map of LGBTQ youth groups, a lot of which are currently running online. And I'm also plugging Misery again. This is just like, this is by no means a proper comprehensive map of what is available. That would be almost impossible because there are so many like things that people set up and so many things that go under the radar. But I wanted to give a shout out to some people who are doing amazing work and to give a bit of a taste of like what's out there if you're interested in learning more. Brilliant.